Alright, so a couple of weeks ago or so, somebody suggested that since I had done Platoon and Full Metal Jacket a few years ago, that I should kind of fill in those final Vietnam gaps with these two. Also noting that the coming in consecutive years with Platoon and Full Metal Jacket being 86 and 87, these being 78 and 79. Obviously also the connection with that is the fact that the one that came previously was the Best Picture winner, and people often question if that's the reason the other two didn't exactly do as well. Obviously, Apocalypse Now did fine as far as nominations go, but only managed to score a couple of wins despite its legendary status. And while we're on Apocalypse Now, that's actually where I'd like to start. This is obviously when this is Coppola post both Godfather movies, post The Conversation, among his earlier work as well, and it kind of seemed to all come to a head at this point, didn't it? Where he was vaguely inspired, I suppose a little more than vaguely, inspired by the Joseph Conrad book, Heart of Darkness, which, where he takes basically some elements of that story and puts them down a river and into Vietnam during the war. And we actually start off in this opening scene with, well, the opening scene obviously is the Doors playing and the jungle catching fire and all that, the helicopters, but then that obviously takes us into this very popular, often parodied scene with Martin Sheen, with basically the walls closing in, and he's obviously, as I just talked about, that this scene was parodied in Major Payne, among many other things. Just waiting for a mission to be brought to him while he's stuck in Saigon. So when that happens, it takes us in many directions we're probably not expecting. Obviously, one of the main interesting things about this movie is how it's basically set up as another war movie where somebody goes on a mission, the end, but we really, if you're like going into this blind, or it's a story you're not completely familiar with, should you be one of those people that's very behind on classic movies, yeah, you really have no idea what you're quite in for if you think it's going to be a normal war movie, obviously. Starting with this narration from Sheen. Usually, narration is kind of like, you really, really have to do it right, and a lot of the times that's not the case. But here, there's something in his voice that's very, you can see, you can imagine what he's seen, what that, before we even get some of his background, just by the sound of his voice and how he talks about his surroundings. But the way that also works is when we get that throughout the movie, it almost does kind of give the movie like a kind of storybook feel, like even though it's set in this really real world and real war, to me, it feels entirely fictional, but I mean that in the best way possible, to where it does feel like it's not just was inspired by this movie, feels like its story could be some kind of classic novel or something. And which really says something about a movie whose visual appeal is one of its main, one of the things most praised about it. So we go in, and he learns from a few people, one of which is Harrison Ford playing a guy named G. Lucas. We just have to acknowledge that because we just can't push that out. But the point here is that it's very clear early on what kind of approach this movie takes as far as pro-war, anti-war, I believe, considering the fact that the entire story is... that really shouldn't matter in regards to which one you are, in regards to how you're going to see this movie. Because this movie really is this giant piece of artistry, at the risk of sounding pretentious, that tells itself in such a way that it's really not hard to see how it got to the status that it does. But what I'm talking about in regards to its approach is the fact that the line, obviously, that comes about this is the fact of he's been ordered to kill Kurtz because Kurtz supposedly has gone insane and killed a few people. And that does seem logical until you think about the surroundings. And obviously, Willard's line is, what is it? Charging somebody with murder in this place is like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500. And so there's something so illogical about this mission, but it seems so incredibly important, but also so incredibly mysterious. Not just because it's so illogical, but the fact that this is a guy that has like a perfect dossier, and he's decorated and beloved, and it just seems to be out of nowhere that this mission is needed. Not to mention the really mysterious dude in the room that's not even in uniform, and we never find out who the fuck he is. Maybe there's somebody that really analyzed this or something that actually knows the answer to that, or maybe Coppola mentioned it or something, but it's a dude just sitting in the room, seeming like he doesn't belong whatsoever, and the only thing he says in this entire scene, in the entire movie, is the "terminate with extreme prejudice" line. And so just that dude in general puts a whole mysterious thing around this. Not to mention that it's just not adding up why this needs to happen. But like Willard, we just have to go with that. That's all we have, and we have no choice but to go with it. And I do like this scene also, the way we get these kind of vague hints at Willard's character and the stuff that he's done, where he has supposedly assassinated people. Like, this is not a first-time thing for him. And they keep that very blurred, but at the same time, that just makes his character all the more magnetic, and really makes you watch and study his performance every time you watch it. It's one of those performances where it almost feels like you can see something new or different that he does in a certain way every time. Even to those of us that have seen it like 50 times or so. So, obviously, as we're going down the river, we get iconic scene after iconic scene. And this is not one of those cases where people just throw the word iconic around. Totally fucking serious when it comes to this. You do not fuck around talking about this movie. Obviously, one of the first is our meeting with Robert Duvall, the only actor in the movie that got an Oscar nomination, interestingly enough. Despite the fact that one of the people he was up against was Frederick Forrest, who plays Chef. He was up for the Rose. They both lost, unfortunately, but they really liked Melvin Douglas and being there that year, I guess. So, obviously, this brings pretty much everything. I mean, I say it's weird that Duvall's the only one, but at the same time, I mean, Duvall's in this movie for like 20 minutes, and in every single frame that Duvall was in, he's doing something that went down in movie history. Whether it be the scene around the fire when Sheen's talking about how this guy seemed untouchable, and just Duvall's presence in general, we get that vibe from him. It's like, we don't even question that. It's like, yeah, yes, we do. We get that just with Sheen saying it, and with Duvall just having to be in this character. But it almost feels like a lot of time we're watching him from a distance, like from like somebody else's point of view, which is really interesting. But then that brings about the fact that this is a guy that wants to liberate this place because supposedly they got killer waves. Because he completely fanboys over Lance because he's like this huge surfing dude of all things. And so they go on and we do this scene. I mean, I had trouble with the idea of this being a video that I would do, because it's kind of like, what do you really say about Apocalypse Now that hasn't already been said? And I feel like the only thing I need to do is acknowledge that the Ride of the Valkyries scene is in it. It just, everybody will say yes, and that is something that makes this movie great. I don't even need to describe it, because everybody knows that. I feel like even people that haven't seen it have to at least know that movie, or that scene, and maybe like a vague idea of what the context of the scene is. So that's, and then obviously a lot of Duvall's lines. There's Charlie Don't Surf, there's I Love the Smell of Napalm in the Morning and all that. And then he vanishes, and then he's gone, and we just go right on down the river and keep going to the next scene. And it's one of those movies that you always wish you could go back and see it again for the first time, because you never know what the next thing down the river is going to be, and it's always something. Sometimes it can be something that's a bit underwhelming, like the Playmates, for instance, but I guess, like, when you're talking about this context, it makes sense to, you know, address the idea of sexual frustration being an issue. So it's like, I guess that's the most spectacular way you can do that. I do love the shot when they first see the USO show coming around the corner, and they're just going down the river in this darkness, and then suddenly these lights, it looks like a damn stadium, and it just out in the middle of nowhere, and it's like, it's kind of a really surreal image that it's just out right in the middle of all this. And so, yeah, that was still handled well, even though it's probably one of the more underwhelming scenes. And it's my understanding the redo, like, went more into that. But I'll talk more about the redo at the end here. But in the meantime, also, one of the things that really stands out here, and was one of its Oscar wins, on top of the cinematography, obviously, is the sound. And that's, like, we talk, like, you could look at the whole Ride of the Valkyrie scene for that, but there's also, like, and it's some stuff that might even seem a bit obvious, but I mean, still, the execution is everything, and it can take something that seems like an obvious idea and just make it this insanely memorable, amazing thing. Like, for instance, Sheen looking up at the fan blades, and the fan blades, we're not quite sure if we're hearing helicopters or the fan itself. Once again, seems obvious, incredible anyway. It really is. And then there is, and just that moment, I really kind of I kind of went past that in general. I talk about all the iconic scenes down the river. I mean, how amazing does a movie have to be to know its grand scale is how people remember it, and it was this whole grand spectacle that went all the way down this river with these enormous shots, these enormous scenes. And yet this is also a movie where the opening scene is just one dude in a room by himself, and they made that riveting before any of this shit even happened. So it's like, we really should have known what we were in for just from that, to know we were going into all of this on top of that, and it's, yeah, it, like, defies words, pretty much. So, but another thing I would like to bring up if we're talking about that area is the score obviously stands out in a very good way, because, I mean, obviously we have the end playing at the very beginning and then when he kills Kurtz, but then there's also there's sometimes where the score sounds very similar to that sound, to where I talk about all the shots, and it's like, these are amazing, beautiful shots, but if you take this score out, it's like, amazing and grand as they are, they would just be war shots, more or less, or helicopters going over jungles, or whatever else. It's this score that really sets up the context of the scenes, to where it's like, if we were to just see those shots, we would think, there's an establishing shot, and I guess they're going somewhere or something, but that score playing, everything feels dangerous. Everything feels like this is not, like, it may look beautiful, but I mean, once we go down and, like, really into the depths of it, it's the complete and total opposite. It is terrifying. And the way they even do it, where it's like, it's sometimes in ways where you would think, if you were to just say this without actually hearing it for yourself, it would sound off. The fact that, like, there's a lot of, like, electronic kind of score in there just sounds like that wouldn't fit, but I mean, it really, really sets a mood that is very, very unique to this movie. I mean, you could make a war movie, and obviously there's going to be some kind of dangerous feel to it, but I mean, there's only one movie that has this kind of feel, and anything else would be, I think even if somebody tried to be this movie, they would be so distant from that accomplishment that you couldn't even tell they were trying to be this movie. So, yes, but anyway, obviously it continues to get more hellacious as they go. And there's one particular scene here that I'm not quite sure works for me entirely. Obviously a lot of it does work, but sometimes, like, the way it comes about feels a bit convoluted, and then the aftermath of it feels a bit like it's beating you over the head a little bit with its tragedy. And that's obviously the scene where Lawrence Fishburne is killed, Mr. Clean. And the thing about this scene is, obviously, it's like, we're toning down a little bit. We've just had the scene when Clean had to open fire and killed that whole family, and then they get a huge dose of what Will really is when he just plugs the mother when they say she's alive, we can take her somewhere. And so we're calming down now, and we're starting to feel closeness to home, because it's the scene where they're reading the letter. So it's like, this is the moment where it's like, so when you're here, it might feel like home is dead, like there is no home anymore. So this is the scene where we kind of calm down, and we realize, yes, there still is a connection through the mail, and we can still see the words and hear the voices of the people we love back at home, and it's not all is lost. So of course this moment has to be interrupted, and which is a very, powerful thing. But it's the way this is brought about. The reason this scene gets cut off in the middle is because Lance is being a fucking dumbass with the purple haze thing, and makes them just one giant purple target. And the way I think it gets a bit heavy-handed in the tragedy portion is the whole... I think it's a nice touch that Mr. Clean's mom sent him a tape, and he's hearing her voice. And it is a very tragic thing, like, even though he's in this hell and he's being gunned down, but maybe, possibly, if he could hear over the gunfire, possibly the last thing he heard was his mom's voice. But... And that, like, the fact that her voice is there as he's dying is a powerful thing. I think it's a little too much that she's actually saying, oh, I can't wait for you to get home, you're gonna grow up, you're gonna give me grandchildren, you're gonna get married. I think that's a little much. And I think it kind of bogs the scene down with, look how much tragedy there is. We get the... if we saw Mr. Clean young as he is, I think he's supposed to be 17, but the story I heard was that Lawrence Fishburne lied about his age so he could get the part. He was actually, like, maybe 3 years younger than he was supposed to be or something. So it's like, we see this young guy killed. We know the possibilities are going through our head. Oh, shit, that could have been somebody's father. That was somebody's son. That could have been somebody's husband. But the fact that we have his mother's voice telling us that, it's like, okay, ease up a little. We know. We know how fucking sad it is. We get it. Not to mention, Chief crying over him like a father is, yeah, it kind of beat it over the head in a movie that has a surprising amount of subtleties in it for how big it is. So that's never always completely worked for me. But, continuing on with that, eventually we do find our way to Kurtz's compound, and it's basically a cult. I don't think they ever say the word cult. I could totally be wrong on that, actually, but but it's very much in that sense. And one of our first glimpses at this, we heard the story in the opening scene about Scott Glenn and how he went there and he, like, abandoned his wife and kids and he, like, sold them off and all that to stay here and be, like, Kurtz's follower. And so we really, really get a first-hand look at this, though, when the first person we meet is Dennis Hopper. One of the more memorable performances in this movie, obviously. And at first we think, okay, maybe there's hope, because he's like, I'm American, I'm one of you guys, and he's, like, real excited. I mean, we know that's trouble, because we heard the stories about Scott Glenn's character and all that, but, I mean, there's at least a glimmer of hope that there's somebody here who is able to kind of be an in-between, like a middleman. But he becomes very uncomfortable very quick. He's obviously very, coked out of his head. Obviously, when you hear the backstory, it's like, is that the photojournalist or is that Dennis Hopper? It's hard to say. Could be both, which is fine. And he's very much, like... Watching the photojournalist talk about Kurtz, it's like watching somebody that's in an abusive relationship. Because he walks up and he's trying to say, Kurtz is great, Kurtz is the man, we all follow him and you're going to follow him too, hopefully, this is going to be great. And then he turns around and he's like, oh, the heads. You're worried about the severed heads laying around, aren't you? You see, sometimes he gets carried away, but he knows it. He knows when he gets carried away. He's addressed it before. It's okay. And it's like... and it's like, it's just pure insanity once we get to this point. And the whole movie obviously has been building to this, where it's like, we go through and we know Brando's presence. Obviously, it is known throughout. Even if you look at, like, The Godfather, and how it feels like Brando's really not in The Godfather very much, but who is, like, the character everybody remembers from The Godfather, I mean, clearly. And so he does have that presence, and I feel like Coppola knew to use that. Apparently there was a huge controversy about putting him in the part and the fact that he got paid like $1 million for it when he's barely in it. And much like Superman the previous year, even though he's barely in it, he's only in one small portion of the movie, he's obviously got the first credit. The credits in this movie are actually kind of weird, because Martin Sheen is third under Brando Duvall. So, but regardless of that, all the build-up, we've seen pictures of Brando in uniform, and we heard his voice on the tape once. And then all we have left is Sheen going through his files, and for a while it starts off as this is all the good stuff he did, like, this is a goddamn hero and all that. And then as it goes on and we learn more and more about what he's doing over here, and it's like, his entire, this had to have been quite easy, because the entire character arc is done for him long before he's on screen. His character's gone through a whole change that's been progressing throughout the entire movie as Willard reads up on him. And so now Brando's job is to be this person we've been building to the whole movie. And as all this shit has gone on, and this is everything that is in his head now. And so much more in his head that we don't know about yet, that we're about to learn about. And yes, the way, I think a lot of it, like, I mean, Brando's good, for sure. He really brings the presence, and he's got that voice. Like, it's one of those cases where you feel like maybe Brando doesn't do a whole lot, but then again, it's like, try to think of somebody else in the part. And it's like, okay, yeah, we're gonna take Brando. So, and so I think a lot of the impact in regards to his first scene is how he's shot. Actually, that's kind of the impact for a lot of his scenes. Because there's that moment, his first scene, we never see his face in full. There's always just the top of his head, or just his hands, or just a portion of his face. But then there's that one moment, shortly before the scene ends, when he finally leans into the light. We get his entire, I mean, we know what Brando looks like, obviously, but so they're not hiding a whole lot. But there's still like a small portion of his face and one of his eyes hiding in the shadows. And it just really adds to that mysterious quality to him that maybe wouldn't have been there if it was just him there in full at first. So it's really the way the shots reveal him to us in very slowly and in portions. I think really has a lot to do with how impactful Kurtz as a character is. That's not to take away from Brando either. I guess that also is in line with the scene after he's decapitated Chef, and we do finally get a full shot of his face coming out of the darkness, and he's like covered in war paint, and it's like you only really understand the pure insanity of a movie when you're like talking about it. I'm realizing this. So the thing here is obviously we finally build up, and the point being that this ending does live up to how much it's been built up to. And it just has these shots, and obviously Brando going into the horror thing where he describes what he's seen and basically how he's gotten to this point. And it's the way that it's got Willard even more fucked up now. I mean, he saw this and he's like, I mean, we're killing everybody and you want me to kill this dude because of all this stuff? That's illogical. And then he goes right to Kilgore, and Kilgore's riding in and just tearing down a town because of the beach to music. Like, it's his thing. It revs him up. And now you get to Kurtz, and you see, like, he's insane. He's fucking insane. But, I mean, he's got such a reason to himself for the reason he's done things. And he has an understanding of his own actions enough to where well, I don't know, he seems to understand that he's insane, and so it's a real, I mean, it's a really complex character. Like, it's like, it's, I guess I say Brando didn't have a lot to do, but I guess that's not true. So yes, but then eventually we do get to this ending, and it might seem like it's probably very, once again, very heavy-handed with the sacrificing the cow and, you know, Kurtz's death happening simultaneously. Might be a bit in your face about it, but yes, it's still a very, very strong ending, and it's really just one of those things when you look back. It's, well, first off, I had heard that apparently there was a long time rumor that hopefully has since been put to rest. I'm sure there's probably still people saying it every now and then, because that's just what happens with movie rumors, but the whole idea that Coppola was supposedly not happy with the ending, with the whole Kurtz thing. Apparently that's not true at all, if you, like, read one thing. So apparently the government where they shot wanted them to burn down the compound they used for Kurtz's place after they shot there. And so Coppola thought, well, why don't I just shoot that? So he basically shot them blowing up the compound. And then for the initial release, he needed something to kind of go over the credits, so he used the footage of the compound blowing up. And people basically thought that was canon for the movie. And so he was very unhappy about that. And that's it. Everything about the Kurtz stuff is fine. It was the one thing about the fuck up with the credits that Coppola didn't like, and obviously is no longer visible in cuts of it. So yeah, that's a rumor, that a very long false rumor that should probably put to bed, and hopefully has been. And obviously it's one of those movies that it's so miraculous that it is what it is when you can read about it, or obviously you can watch Hearts of Darkness, which I have, and it's definitely, it does feel like a miracle that this movie came out the way it did. I mean, you hear about, you know, especially for as elaborate as movies get, that there's gonna be troubled shoots. But it's almost like this fucking thing was cursed, because there was the whole, there was the typhoon that took out some of the sets they were going to use, so they couldn't even shoot some of that stuff, which apparently would have just been scenes in the redo anyway. There was, I think, towards the beginning of production, Martin Sheen had a heart attack, like, on the set. There was, the whole idea that Brando, I guess Brando was just supposed to be Brando, more or less, and he showed up overweight and didn't know any of his damn lines. Which obviously was a problem on The Godfather as well, but I guess it was, like, really out of hand this time around. Like, he was really, really hard to deal with. On top of the fact that they're paying him $1 million to do this, which obviously in '79 was, was a huge, huge deal. There's the whole Dennis Hopper constantly being on drugs thing for as long as, this is like 10 years after Easy Rider, and he's still, like, all on the he has not stopped since. There's the moments I liked in Hearts of Darkness when Coppola is, like, losing his mind, and he's trying to figure out how to do this, and he's going insane, he's yelling at people, and Dennis Hopper's just off to the side of, Francis, man. And obviously his wife, like, wrote a whole journal or something about just basically at home he was a legitimate insane person, Coppola was. And how he basically, like, there's the famous picture of him with the gun to his head. He had made, you know, Godfather and Godfather 2, and he was, like, drowning in Oscars. And then he basically, like, put all the money he had on the line to finish this, because that's the only that's what it came down to. And like I said, though, you can sum all this up by watching Hearts of Darkness, but which is strongly recommended. But yes, it's very easy to see, though, how we got such a great movie. As far as the redo goes, I mean, they extended some scenes. I do like the fact that they extended, like, some of the Kurtz scenes, which does seem necessary, and, like, kind of basking in the river scenes a bit more. The plantation thing, though, is... Yeah, because the thing about this movie is that there aren't any dry spots. If the plantation scene had stayed in this movie, it would have had a dry spot. There's definitely a reason. I've only watched the redo once. I only watched the regular version after I got a sense of what the redo... After I watched the redo in full and got a sense of, okay, I saw that. Like, I guess a lot of people, like, consider them two different movies, pretty much. But, and that's... Yeah, I'd say that's probably about right, so... Yeah, I'm sticking to the regular version, though, so we don't have that. Because the thing about it, when I talk about... When a movie has dry spots, there's usually moments that you just kind of don't remember. Like, they're just kind of a portion of the movie, and you kind of just wait for them to go by, and then you get back to the good stuff. But this movie doesn't have that. I started to notice this... This had to have been 7 or 8 years ago. I was seeing it for the third time, because I had seen the regular and the redo, and then my third time I was showing my brother. And the thing about it was, I had seen it twice before, and it's long. Obviously the redo is very long, and the regular movie is still long, 2.5 hours. And the thing about it was, when I was watching the movie for my third time, and these weren't, like, consecutive, they were relatively far apart. So, when I was watching it the third time with my brother, I realized that I remembered every single scene. Because usually, when you watch something more than once, the whole thing's not in here. I mean, there will be moments when you may be watching something and you say, oh yes, I forgot about that moment, or I don't really remember this, it must have been not important enough to me. You remember every single moment of this movie after you've seen it. And for a 2.5-hour movie, that is, yeah, I mean, obviously you can do that for long movies, but, I mean, one that you've only seen once or twice, obviously, you know, as many times as I've seen it now, it's... Yeah, this movie, like, flies by, but I mean, just to know, like, every single moment of it after the second or third time, it's really insane that a movie can pull that off. And yeah, so as far as Oscars go, yeah, obviously there is the whole thing about it immediately followed The Deer Hunter, which did win Best Picture, so it's like, did that have anything to do with it? Because it is... I don't typically like to think in this way in regards to what won and what didn't, because it's such a tired thing, and there's really no reason to argue, because once something is picked, it's over, and just go on. It's not, like, going to affect your opinion of it or anything. So, one of those big complaints, on par with Shakespeare in Love over Saving Private Ryan Wood, or whatever the fuck people complain about, is Kramer vs. Kramer is the movie that won over Apocalypse Now. A movie where Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep go to court to fight over their son, won Best Picture, and Robert Benton, who directed that movie, won Best Director over Coppola. And I do get... Kramer vs. Kramer is special in its own way. I've actually already done a review for it on there. And Kramer vs. Kramer is great. And Kramer vs. Kramer, like I said, is big and powerful in its own way. It's clearly not the spectacle movie that this is. It's clearly not got, you know, all the things it wants to explore like this movie does. It wasn't, you know... Robert Benton probably didn't have a gun to his head while he was making Kramer vs. Kramer. So that's something people look back on and they say, what in the holy hell? But the thing about it, though, is, like I said, Kramer vs. Kramer is powerful in its own way that is totally completely different from this, obviously. But the thing about this movie was that when you have a movie this big that tries to be this deep and say something this powerful or this meaningful, you are gonna divide people. I mean, obviously it is clearly, like, 99% beloved. But, I mean, especially at the time of release, when you're not always sure what's going to be a classic and what isn't, you could see stuff where there actually were criticisms, stuff like, I guess some people thought that the intellect was a bit surface level. I think the movie is deeper than that, but I do understand that criticism. I could see how somebody could see it that way, for sure, where it's trying to, like, be almost... It's trying to drown you with its style so that it can be anything it says, small, in regards to these giant backgrounds might seem as significant as the surroundings, but ultimately may not be, but they took advantage of that. I could see somebody legitimately thinking that. And then there's the whole thing about people thought that Brando was being cast, like, as a distraction. Like, that Kurtz is just spewing bullshit, but it sounds a lot more prophetic and meaningful if it's coming from Brando's delivery. Once again, I could see that criticism. There was the idea that I guess people were really pissed off about the fact that he was so adamant about making sure people knew that it was based on Heart of Darkness, or inspired by Heart of Darkness. So people basically thought he was using Conrad's name to build the movie up, to make it seem, you know, more profound and more kind of coasting on that name. I don't think the maker of The Godfather 1 and 2 needs a name to coast on, but apparently that was a big criticism back in the day, so I would like to think that explains that at least a little bit. That a movie as kind of universally powerful as something like Kramer versus Kramer, it could be something, it could beat something that is so big that it might divide people, but like I said, as the years have gone on, it's clear this has taken the mantle as one of the greatest movies ever made. You pretty much anybody you ask will probably tell you that. So, yes, I don't know how much time that took, but we've got to talk about the Deer Hunter still. I'm sorry, I almost forgot you were here. I do want to say one more thing about Apocalypse Now, and that is, this actually is it probably just looks like a still. This actually is a DVD case. I don't know if you can see where the title's actually engraved in there. And the weird thing about it is that it's not, it comes in this case, which is, obviously looks like a folder. And it's the original and the redo, but it's not one of these discs is the regular one and one is the redo. Both of them are Act 1 and Act 2. Like, they're split up in two parts. And the first part of the regular and the redo are on the first disc. The second part of the regular and the redo are on the second disc. It's weird and kind of a pain in the ass when you're watching it, but nevertheless, I've had this DVD forever and I do love it. So yes. But yes, let's go on to the Deer Hunter. Another one that came in a really awesome case that I've had forever. This badass picture of De Niro on the back of it too. So the Deer Hunter takes us back a year to '78, and it's definitely not near as much of a war movie as, say, Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, or Platoon, but obviously it shapes everything about this movie. Because obviously when we start off, it's about an hour and 10 minutes into the 3-hour runtime that we get into the war, but the whole thing does kind of build up to that. But this is a movie to where it's clearly not kind of like these war movies like this have kind of a thing about them that you'll probably notice. I go back to the Dennis Leary bit when he's talking about how he wants to watch Apocalypse Now on his giant system and all that. And how we have like Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, and Platoon, and it's like they kind of have this way about them that's comes off like this kind of man's man type movie. I shudder kind of saying that, but I think you get exactly what I mean by that. To where guys will watch these movies to kind of get themselves revved up or whatever, and it becomes kind of that kind of movie. The Deer Hunter obviously does not fall into that category. Like when people are talking about, you know, yeah, I watch Apocalypse Now and it's amazing, I watch Full Metal Jacket and it's amazing. You don't really hear that about the Deer Hunter because the Deer Hunter is not that kind of movie at all. It is for like half an hour out of 3 hours, I guess, but still, no, not really. And I think that's the really appealing thing about it, is how seriously it takes how the war has affected these people. And I think that's another thing that's so appealing about Apocalypse Now to me when I was talking about the fictional aspect was, you look at a movie like The Deer Hunter, and the amazing thing about it is how it humanizes these guys. And spends so much time humanizing these guys. And you could say the same thing about, like, in Platoon, some of them might get kind of a bit movie-like in characters like Sergeant Barnes. But the whole idea is how realistically they depict the war and the people in them. But and so with that, Apocalypse Now feels very much like in its own fictional world outside of reality. But here we're going very much into reality, where the first hour and 10 minutes or so is just getting to know these guys in their environment. They're normal guys, they go to work, they work in like a factory or whatever, and then John Savage is getting married. So they're all building up to that, and they're all doing the pre-wedding kind of buddy-buddy thing, and then they're going to go to the reception and party, and then they're going to go hunt when the sun comes up. All before they're gone to Vietnam. And the reason this is so long and so important is you look at these movies and you see, yeah, these characters, like, oh, I got a little bit of his backstory, so I know him, he's good. When he dies, I'll be sad. Or when something bad happens to him, I'll be sad. And on to the next one and so on. But a lot of the times, they get lost in the shuffle. And there's this argument of, like, everything is done well, but it's like, do I really care that much about the characters? Like, do we know enough about them to care? The Deer Hunter was going to make damn sure you knew these people before they go off to war. And because that's only going to make what happens afterwards all the more effective. So we get this wedding reception. It's basically like, I don't know how many of you have seen The Leopard with Burt Lancaster. Another very long movie, and like a very large portion of that movie in the middle, like a good 40 minutes of that movie is a party. And that's it. That's very much, I almost wonder if Cimino kind of took inspiration from The Leopard when he made this very long wedding reception scene. And once again, it may feel very tedious and redundant after a while. But the thing about it is we really wanted to go beyond what we were doing with characters in a war movie here. Where it's like, they could have basically started at Vietnam, and then when they get back, they are the way that they are, and we just accept that as, well, they're the way that they are because of the war, man, and that's about it. That's all we have to go on. But when you see the change, you see the third part of this movie so differently than you would if we didn't have the first part, because you've seen what they were before and how very normal people they were. And then when they go and we see them at the wedding reception, even when they don't have dialogue, when we just see like walking, dancing, or De Niro hitting on Streep or whatever, we get a sense about them just watching them be people from a distance. And the movie gives us a very long time to do that and to really get, see them lived in and get invested in them, so that we know just how crucial the difference is on the other side. And also, this plays into even though the Vietnam scene is actually quite short in the long run in total in regards to the movie, there as well, obviously with the subtraction of John Cazale, who is like, John Cazale was always kind of getting the short end of the stick with these characters here. He's always the one that's being belittled and the one we're not supposed to particularly like. And it's like, why don't you just, give me your boots, De Niro? And it's like, De Niro might as well have just said, because your fucking father says so, Fredo. But the thing is once we get to those moments, and there is a lot that's brought here, and not necessarily just, oh, watch them interact and now I care about them. To get into the specifics of it before we go to the Vietnam stuff, I almost got ahead of myself. There is the one scene. I'm still not quite sure how I feel about the wine scene. I know it only lasts for like a second, but it's like, we kind of figured something bad was going to happen. We didn't necessarily need if you don't spill a drop of wine, you'll have good luck forever, and oh shit, she got some on her. So it's like, we kind of knew without that scene something bad was going to happen, probably. So, with that foreshadowing, there's also, it's also, like, that's the thing though, this movie is so character-driven. Going back, one of the things I wanted to point out that I didn't, before, when I was talking about the whole man's man thing, was, I go to Jarhead, Sam Mendes' movie, when there's the scene when they're in the theater watching Apocalypse Now to get revved up. They're watching the Ride of the Valkyries scene. And then there's a later scene. Obviously, the scene devolves into something else, but the idea of the scene is that they're all going to sit down and watch the deer hunter. So it's like, I'm trying to imagine. It's funny that that scene got cut off, because now I'm just sitting here thinking, like, trying to imagine watching these, like, revved up Marines that are, like, battle thirsty, watching, like, the wedding scene for an hour of the deer hunter before it gets to the Vietnam scene. And it's just kind of funny to me. It's like, that's why I'm saying I don't think the Deer Hunter works as that kind of movie, because it's above that, is I guess what I'm trying to say. But anyway, we also get the moment on the basketball court or whatever that was when Walken's talking about. He's just kind of casually saying, like, hey man, when we're in Vietnam and stuff, don't you leave me there. He's like, dude, I wouldn't leave you there. And he's like, don't. And at that time, they're so casual about it. We have no fucking idea how important that's going to be and how much that's going to come back into their lives in an enormously shattering way. So they are just planting these seeds in these moments, and it's not necessarily just look at them be real people, now we care. So it really does do a great job of setting everything up that's going to be important later. And that's going to really, really bring us into this. And then we go on to the hunting scene, which, once again, seems like hardly important, except that it gives us the title. But this hunting scene has to be one of the most cinematic things in movie history, I swear to God. Whether it be the score, or the way it's shot, the framing of the actors, any of that. It's just this beautiful damn scene. But the thing about this also is, I don't know if Cimino's really said anything about this. If it was an intentional thing, but I'm going to assume so. If you also want to take the approach of, is it anti-war? It's hard to say in regards to, like, I mean, in some movies it seems clear that they are, but everybody has a way of looking at shit like that. You notice I kind of dance around this whole topic in general. But the thing about it is, before they're about to go hunting for deer, they do have this dialogue about shooting, and they kind of get all into the whole thing about it, and like shooting the deer, and how they just make this whole big thing about it. Like this big profound thing or whatever. So it's always been interesting to me that they talk about this whole profound shooting other things, like deer thing, and then when they go to Vietnam, where a lot of shooting is probably going to commence, these guys that were talking about shooting other things like deer spend most of the movie with their guns pointed where? Yeah, at themselves. So I assume there's something there's almost like an irony there. So I always thought that was very interesting, the way they take the Russian Roulette way. Which brings us to the Vietnam scenes, where we can almost kind of do the Kubrick jumping from the bone to space thing with, we're in the bar, we're playing quiet music, everybody was rowdy before, and now nobody's talking, we're just kind of sitting here, and they're just kind of anticipating the fact that their lives are going to change forever. And then with hardly any transition whatsoever, exploding buildings in Vietnam, and we're here now, and we are thrust into it instantly. We are like right in the middle of it. There is no, they go from here, they say goodbye, they take the trip, and they get there, they go through all the shit, and then all hell breaks loose. They're home, the hell breaks loose. No middle ground. And it can be really disorienting in a good way, like in a way that is intentional, to kind of just throw us right into this. And we almost feel as kind of, obviously from a complete distance, but I mean, as an audience, we kind of feel that shock of the characters realizing that this is not where they once were, and in a totally different place. And then that's when almost immediately we're thrust into the Russian Roulette scene. Another thing where you'd think there'd be like a whole lot of build-up or something, especially how much you hear about it, but it is disorienting how fast we get to the crucial scenes in this movie after so much build-up. The Vietnam scenes just get right to the damn point. And this is clearly, once again, I did just say this was the most something in movie history. I'm about to say that again, because it's true. Probably one of the most terrifyingly suspenseful scenes in movie history. clearly, I mean, what better way to to make your audience engage in suspense than putting a game of Russian Roulette in any movie, let alone one where you're already in the middle of the fucking Vietnam War. And we have to, and the scene, the way we actually get to the scene when Walken and De Niro have to face off doing this, even before that, when it's just two dudes we don't know, it's watching John Savage's performance in this scene, and the way De Niro's kind of in the middle here, because De Niro is trying to calm down Savage while, like, just the sound of the clicks, he thinks any second now is going to be gunfire, and just watching him kind of viscerally react to this is very unnerving. And then it's almost like a foreshadowing of what's eventually, which characters are going to end up where, because Walken in this scene is just kind of calmly watching all this happen. And we know Walken has been a level-headed person through the whole movie. And then it's like right at this moment of him watching this game, it's even, obviously the obvious turn is when he's actually playing. But I mean, in this scene when he's just kind of not watching, but you can tell that it's like going through his head at this whole scenario because they're underneath. And it's, yeah, you can already kind of start to see the turn. Like, this has already affected him before he's even up there playing it. And so when that scene finally happens, when that scene comes, and it suddenly occurs to us that any of these people could die. Probably not De Niro, because he's got the above title credit, and it's only about an hour and 20 minutes in. But I mean, that does not... Once you're in this scene, you're in this scene, and anybody can be victim to just the total, completely random act of violence that is that game. And the fact that it seems, inevitable that we're going to lose a main character because two of our main characters are facing off against each other in a game that only ends in death. And should they refuse to play this game, they've got other guns trained on them because they're being held prisoner. There is no fucking way out of this. And the movie manages to somehow get De Niro to figure out how to get the gun loaded more. The 3 bullets, 1, 2, 3. And the thing is we managed to see him shoot this place up. They escape, and they hang off of a helicopter as it is flying away, trying to get out. And the great thing that's done here, and the way Cimino handled it, was this could have played like a very out-of-place action scene. But just the way it's executed, it doesn't feel like that at all. It still feels like the very real world of the Vietnam War, watching all this play out. Even if it starts to feel very movie-like, they don't cross that line, and they don't make it seem like necessarily unrealistic. I don't know, him being able to take out the whole room, but it doesn't take you out of it. It still makes you feel like there's still that danger there. And you still feel like, even as long as they're in Vietnam, that something maybe even worse can happen. So I thought that was really well done. But then once again, it's like the Vietnam parts aren't near as much of the movie as you remember. I'm always surprised, however many times I see this, I'm always surprised how early the Vietnam scenes are over and they're back home. But I think that's the thing. I think that's the whole staying power that those moments have with, it's the fact that they feel, in your mind when you're looking back, they seem much longer than they actually are. And I think that's all about the impact that they have, that you feel like that's a much bigger portion of the movie than it actually is. And God, those scenes with De Niro playing when he's getting slapped, and then he's got that fucking intense look on his face when he knows he's about to shoot the place up. And so he goes from that intensity to that laugh. It's like an ultimate classic De Niro thing. That is 70s De Niro all over. And it's crazy intense. When they go back home, there's definitely some power to this. Mainly the fact of the whole transition of it, because we talked about the quiet in the bar scene, but I mean, if you look at it as a whole thing, the bigger picture, there's a whole lot of noise in the opening, because we've got, the noise from the factory they work at, and then there's the fact that they're always, they're party animals, and there's horseplay and stuff like that. They're singing "I Love You, Baby" and stuff like that, or whatever the name of that song actually is. And then they go to the wedding, and they're all rowdy at the reception, and then De Niro starts streaking, and then Vietnam, all this stuff, and then so when they go home, it's like dead quiet, because the sound of Vietnam is in the past, and the sound of the happiness and the dancing and the music is also in the past. So it's just so incredibly, unbearably calm and quiet when they're home and things have totally and completely changed. Walken disappears. John Savage lost his legs and is in a hospital. So De Niro's the one that has to walk around and be greeted with parties, knowing and seeing the shit that he's seen. And I do think the movie does suffer from overlength. I don't think it totally earns that 3 hours. But it does make its points in pretty big ways. The scenes with Streep, as important as they are and as good as she is, I think there's probably one or two too many of those scenes. They kind of start to become a little tedious when we get the idea of his relationship to her and what it would mean for other things. And then there's the whole thing that this was the same year as Coming Home. And so it's like, we already have an entire movie. If you want to talk about movies that affect the outcome of other movies, it's like we have an entire movie this year that went on to also great success. That's basically an entire movie that is the last third of this one. And has a lot more, basically has a lot more things going on. But like I said, though, because we've had all that stuff and we've seen all that stuff through these characters, when the characters really do get those big scenes, particularly together, when we're seeing, like, the downfall of Walken, those scenes are much more powerful because of what we got before it. And these scenes owe a lot to that. Not to take anything away from them, especially Walken, who obviously won the Oscar for this. I think a lot of people forget he's an Oscar winner because this happened so long ago, but he definitely is. And so, yeah, and we do kind of go in that direction, and it does kind of start to become a bit obvious until we really go into exactly what has happened to Walken. And then that's when we start to realize just how tragic this story is gonna get. Just when we think it couldn't be anymore. And then eventually we see that it's like this whole thing about friendship and loyalty and devotion, and the way that he does go back for Walken like he said he would, but it just, in the circumstances they never could have suspected back then. And it's just really this heartbreaking thing when you go and, like, when he finds Walken after all this time, and how everybody's so worried about him, and he's gone. He's just not in there. He does not know De Niro anymore. And this whole, like, obviously the game of Russian Roulette in Vietnam, the first one, is what drove him to this point. And now that is just, it's like his mind went there to cope and then got stuck. And now that's all his mind is playing this game. And obviously has a terribly tragic outcome. And then that's when you realize this whole movie has been one long progression. Because we started at a wedding and we ended at a funeral. So, yeah, so it's pretty easy to see why this would be an Oscar success. His competition was, obviously Coming Home was up for a picture that year, with Jon Voight and Jane Fonda taking the lead actor and actress. And there was also, like, Midnight Express and Heaven Can Wait and An Unmarried Woman with Jill Clayburgh. So, yeah, I think Midnight Express is a very strong competitor, but it's pretty easy to see how this could win so easily. And it's worth noting, like I said, it did, like, in a case with Coming Home, it's almost like in any other year, if two movies were that close together, they might cancel each other out, but The Deer Hunter was just way too powerful. And not to mention the little tidbit that it's to my understanding that John Wayne presented this movie as the Best Picture winner, and that was his last public appearance before his death. So that's kind of profound in its own way, especially given the topic at hand and the fact that they mention him at the beginning. So, yes, obviously the Deer Hunter is very, very powerful. I do think its length kind of... the in-between of when they come back and when Walken's story comes back into play, there's a lot of good stuff in there, but it is kind of bogged down by just how much it kind of drags itself out. But, so yeah, it may not have the power, the constant power of something like Apocalypse Now, which really is just, like I said, it just really engraves itself in your mind. So that's, I don't think I need to say anything else about Apocalypse Now. I think I've done enough with that. And yes, I do appreciate the Deer Hunter very much. I don't know if this sounded too down on it, but it's definitely still very good stuff, and as far as Best Picture winners go, a very much deserved place for that. So, yes, that's going to do that for this. Next week, our versus is going to be the fact that it will be December 1st, when we are in a certain time of year, and for some reason, I have somehow not talked about this movie yet, so I'm going to do that. And then, as I said before, I'm definitely seeing Bremen J. Israel Esquire, as well as Daddy's Home 2 I will finally see, and I'm really hoping Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri is on its way. It's like, once again, it's supposed to be wide on the 1st. I don't know if that's everywhere or what, but we'll figure that out. So, yes, until then,